So what I wanted to do today is I wanted to talk to you about our Masters of Finance programs. And then we also have Emily on hand who will answer any questions that some of you may have about Actuarial Studies and Statistics. I'm the Finance Masters convener. So the Master of Finance, the Master of Applied Finance, the Master of Financial Management, they're my areas. But I thought I'd defer to Emily for anything in the other programs because she is much more aware of their structure. So if I could ask everyone to ask any questions that they have using the chat function at the moment, and then at the end of the presentation, depending on how many people are in the room, I'll either have a read of the questions and Emily and I can answer them, or I'll just unmute everyone, stop sharing the screen, bring us all up together, and we can have a more free exchange of conversation. It will depend on the number of participants and how easy that is to manage. Now, we essentially, when it comes to the master's programs in finance, we have 3 different programs, and these 3 programs are what we call nested. In other words, our shortest program is the Master of Financial Management. It's a 1-year course, and this course is the first year of the 1.5-year Master of Applied Finance, and the Master of Applied Finance is the first 1.5 years of the Master of Finance. Now, one of the real benefits of those is that it means that there's flexibility within our programs. As I'm going to discuss in a moment, to join the shorter programs, you need to come from what we call a cognate discipline. So you need to have a background that's finance, engineering, mathematics, that kind of thing. You can come into the Master of Finance from any background, but once you're in our programs, there is flexibility in terms of moving from one program to the other, provided you are always completing your courses in the correct order. And that's one of the things I'm here for, as well as our CBE information team, talk about program transfers and what courses you should do if you want to keep that open as an option for you. Now let's start with the Master of Finance. And this is our longest program. It's a 2-year program. And to enroll in it, you can come from any field. So it doesn't need to be finance, accounting, sciences. You can come from liberal arts. It wouldn't matter. What you need is a GPA average of at least 5 out of 7 for a domestic university or the international equivalent. Now, there is more flexibility in entering the Master of Finance, but there is one caveat in remaining in the program that doesn't exist in our other options. And that is that in order to progress from the first year to the second year of the course, of the master's program, you need a 60% average across your first year of courses. Now, you don't need 60% in every course. You just need the average across those to equal 60% or above. If you don't achieve a 60% average in your first year, you'll be transferred to our Master of Applied Finance, where you'll have 6 months remaining. And I'll show you the program structures of each of our degrees in a moment. Now, the Master of Applied Finance is our 1.5-year program. And this is one of those programs where you need to come from what we call a cognate discipline. Now, you can see that these are fairly broad. It, yes, includes finance and economics, but it also includes accounting, business information systems, marketing, mathematics. It just means that you have some familiarity with the background that we're going to be introducing you to. And again, you need the same GPA average through your undergraduate program of at least 5 out of 7 or the international equivalent. The Master of Financial Management is our 1-year program, and it is the first year, as I said, of our longer programs. Now, again, you need to come from a cognate discipline, and again, you need that average GPA of at least 5 out of 7. To give you a better idea of how our degrees actually sit within each other, what you can see here is an example study plan for our longest program, the Master of Finance. Now, I'm going to take you through why we structure it this way, but before I do, and before I drill into the courses themselves, what you can see is that you've got the first 3 semesters of the Master of Finance as your Master of Applied Finance. That's the math in blue outline, and then the MFM, the Master of Financial Management, is the first 2 semesters. So provided you do your courses in the correct order, and the prerequisites help you with that because it does actually enforce an order on a lot of our courses, you could enter a 2-year, get sick of it and leave at 1, or you could enter a 1-year adore it and extend to a 2-year program. Now, if you have a look at the different courses that you can see here, I wanted to talk a bit about why it's structured in this way to help give you an idea of what you'd learn and how you'd learn it as you progress through our master's programs. If you have a look in the top left, where you've got the first semester of year 1, one of the things you're probably noticing when you have a look at this list is out of all of the different semester offerings, this is the one where the course codes differ the most. The reason for that is that your introductory semester is not about you learning everything about finance. It's about you learning the basics of all of, not just the finance concepts, but the concepts that closely tie into it. Right, so it's not just your foundations of finance, it's the introductory accounting course, Business 7008. It's your introductory statistics course, Stat 7055. And there's an elective there, but the vast majority of people do business economics. A small minority do the other one, which is mathematical statistics. But the reason it's a small minority is you need to actually be exempted from Stat 7055 in order to do the stat elective in that first semester. That just accommodates the students that come from a heavy statistics background. So let me talk you through a little bit about the type of thing you'll learn, starting with accounting, and I'll move around finance before ending with our first year finance course here. Let's start with financial statements and reporting. Now, some of you may have done a bit of accounting already, and some of you may love that. I did accounting as well in my undergraduate degree. I have to admit it wasn't my favorite part of my program, but it was absolutely vital in terms of specializing in finance. Now, I want you guys to imagine that you have done your Masters of Finance, say, and you've gone out into industry, and your first role is an equity analyst. You might work for an investment bank, for example, and you need to value a company and write a recommendation report to say whether that company should be bought or sold by your clients. So let's say that you're trying to decide what the value of shares in Telstra is. Now, you'll do a lot of things. You'll understand the company's operations. You'll learn a bit about their management structure, about their key products and offerings. But you're also going to need to understand how they perform. Now, the way you're going to have to do that is you're going to need to look at the accounting statements of Telstra. Right? So it's not just reading their website. You need to understand their balance sheet, their statement of cash flows, their income statement. And you need to know how to take those items and put them into your equity valuation model, which after a bit of analysis is going to tell you what you believe shares in Telstra are worth. So it's crucial that you understand your basic accounting statements in order to actually value a company, which is the whole basis of buying and selling in order, for example, to outperform the market, right? We want to buy stocks that are undervalued, sell stocks that are overvalued. Well, you can't decide whether they're under or overvalued unless you know what you value the stocks are and compare that to the market price. Another one is financial statistics. Again, some people adore statistics and want to do more of it. Other people, it might not be so much their thing. But irrespective of whether it is your area or not, and apologies, I'm just going to take my screen brighter again, whether it is your area or not, in order to understand the financial concepts that you're going to learn, you need to understand the basic forms of statistics. You need to understand how to run a regression, what it means to have a t-statistic or an r-squared. Because without that, it's one thing to observe that two effects tend to happen together. It's another thing to be able to show that one causes the other. You don't want to observe two completely random financial phenomenon and assume that they're associated. You need to test how that might be the case. So that's financial statistics. And then the last non-finance course in that first semester is typically business economics. Now, again, business economics or economics in general, and this course covers both micro and macroeconomics, is very important in understanding how financial markets work. Think about what's happening in the equity market, the share market at the moment because of coronavirus. Back in March, when the epidemic really did become established and widespread, we saw equity markets pretty much around the world plummet. Now, the reason for that is partly that people were concerned about the ability of companies to operate, but also people were scared. When people are worried, they tend to sell risky investments. They want to put their money in safer investments where they're less exposed to things like volatility in markets. So what happens? People get scared and they start selling. That creates what we call excess supply because more people want to sell their shares than buy them, and it causes prices to fall. And that's why you see the financial market charts plummet in March. We've since seen markets recover quite a bit, particularly in the US, where there are a lot of technology stocks that do very well out of things like the move online. Zoom is a good example. We're using it right now. But perhaps the best example, if we go right back to the 19th century, of why supply and demand, which you learn in economics, matters in financial markets, it comes down to Baron Rothschild and what is rumoured to have occurred in the Battle of Waterloo. So back in the 19th century, the Battle of Waterloo was about the Brits fighting, the Britons fighting the French. Everyone in England was terrified that they might lose the battle and potentially the war as a result. Now, Baron Rothschild was a very wealthy man. You would have heard of the Rothschild Empire, perhaps. And he had a flock of carrier pigeons that were trained to bring him news. Because back then, there was no phones, no internet. The way typically messages were transmitted across countries is that a person would get on a horse, ride that horse through the evening, through the day until the horse and they became exhausted, where they would be arranged to meet another person, pass on the message, they would get on their horse, continue to gallop across the country, and so on, till someone in France passed on the message to enough people that the message arrived in England. So imagine that process. It takes a lot of time. And now imagine that you give a message to a carrier pigeon who just flies straight across. It's a much quicker mode of communications transport. So what happened is Baron Rothschild learnt the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo far before anyone else in England. Now the outcome is that England won the battle, which is a wonderful thing, a euphoric thing, but that's not actually what he is rumoured to have released to the market. Some of you might already guess that what he actually was rumoured to release is that they lost the battle. Suddenly everyone becomes terrified. They start selling any investment that could possibly have risk to convert it to cash because it is seen as the safe asset, cash. There's a flight to safety for gold, for example, things that they can take with them. That caused a huge oversupply, right? Everyone wants to sell, no one wants to buy. That causes prices to plummet. And Baron Rothschild was purchasing these assets at much, much lower prices than they were worth before he let out that rumor. Then all he needed to do is sit back and wait for the last person on the horse to ride into England and announce that they'd won the war, won the battle. Suddenly everyone's euphoric. They start wanting to purchase those assets back. That created excess demand, pushed prices up. And of course, who was selling it to everyone else? Baron Rothschild. He bought them at a low price, sold them at a high price, and profited. So the reason that economics is so important is that prices in financial markets are about more than just fundamental values. They're also about how we as humans interact with those markets. And if you have things like excess supply and demand, it can cause prices to deviate from their fundamentals. And that comes back to your role as an equity analyst deciding whether Telstra is priced too high or too low. And then the last course in the first semester is Foundations of Finance. Now, this is where we introduce you to the core financial concepts and underpin the rest of the program. There are three core concepts that we look at in Foundations of Finance. It's a great course. It's one of the courses I teach, and I think it's beautifully structured in the way it then enables you to drill down into the deeper material as you progress through the program. The first concept is what we call the time value of money. Now, let's say that everyone on this call was offered a choice. I will either give you $100,000 right now before you leave the Zoom call, or I might wait and offer you $100,000 20 years from now. Now, it's a bit difficult because everyone's muted, but just have a think to yourself, which would you prefer? Do you want the $100,000 now, or do you want it in 20 years' time? Now, I'm hoping that most of you have said that you'd like the money today. There's a couple of reasons for that. 20 years and I might not be around. 20 years and you might not be able to track me down to insist on the money. But most importantly, if you have the money now, you can do something with it. You can invest it. You can invest it to produce a positive return so that it is worth a lot more than 100,000 20 years from now. Whereas if you didn't get the 100,000 until 20 years time, that's all it would be worth, right? So the time value of money is about the fact that the sooner you have cash inflows, the more opportunity you have to invest those inflows. You don't just shove it under your mattress. You put them in investments to make that money grow. Likewise, if you have outflows, you would rather pay it later than earlier because it gives you a chance to save and invest that money so it can accumulate. So when we value a financial asset, we need to decide what cash flows it's going to produce. A share will produce dividends. A debt instrument will produce interest payments. And the value of that instrument is what we call the present value of those cash flows. And the reason that the time value of money matters is that we put a higher value on a cash flow received today or in 1 year than on that same cash flow received 20 years from now. So that's the first concept. The second concept we look at in Foundations of Finance is what we call diversification. Now, the idea of diversification is simple. You don't put all of your eggs in one basket. I don't know how many of you are that familiar with what happened in the global financial crisis, but I'm guessing that a lot of you may have heard of Lehman Brothers. It was not a company that weathered the GFC. They collapsed. Now, let's say that you had all of your money in Lehman Brothers. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, the owners, the shareholders of that company received very, very little. So all of your wealth would be gone. Now, let's say instead, you didn't just invest in Lehman Brothers. You invested in a lot of different stocks. You didn't just invest in a lot of financial stocks. You invested in stocks in lots of different industries. You had healthcare, consumer staples, technology, resources. And you didn't just invest in one country. You invested in multiple countries. And you didn't just invest in equities. You also invested in bonds and commodities and property. Suddenly, you have a well-diversified portfolio. So when something like the global financial crisis or the current situation with COVID-19 hits, your portfolio is likely to go down, but it will recover, right? Because not every investment will collapse. Some will, but they'll only be a small proportion of your portfolio. Then the third part of Foundations of Finance is what we call arbitrage and the rule of buy low, sell high, which we use to value derivatives. Now, the idea behind derivatives is that you're essentially you're agreeing to either buy or sell some underlying asset at a price agreed on in the future. And the way that we value derivatives is a law that's called the law of arbitrage. And what we mean by arbitrage is arbitrage would be an opportunity in which you could buy low, sell high, and get a zero-cost risk-free profit. Now, obviously, if that was the case, everybody would want to do it. Locking in a zero-cost risk-free profit is like me putting a box down in the center of a room, and every time you press that box, money pops out. You're never going to stop pressing that button. Now, if that's the case, let's say that there were two assets that were identical in every way. If you could purchase it at the low price and sell it at the high price, everyone would do it. Everyone would want to be buying the undervalued asset. And remember your economics, excess demand will push that price up. Everyone will be selling the overvalued asset, excess supply, bringing it down. And that's going to happen until the two assets are worth the same amount. So we use that to value our derivatives contracts, and that underpins what you can see as applied derivatives in the third semester of the Master of Finance program. But you can see that the first semester is all about providing that broad base of understanding, because finance doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's lots of interconnected disciplines that you need that general knowledge of in order to then deepen your knowledge of finance as a specific discipline. Move into semester 2, and we're starting to deepen that knowledge. So applied corporate finance, we're using the time value of money concepts from Foundations of Finance to value a range of different financial assets. We're looking further at debt, at equity, at whether you might want to lease or purchase an asset. We look at things like mergers and acquisitions, for example, and lots of different ways to value the cash flows of a company. In applied investments, we build on the knowledge you learned in Foundations of Finance in that middle diversification part. Right? You learn how better to structure well-diversified portfolios and how to evaluate how that portfolio performs through things like measuring the alpha of an investment, which some of you might have heard of. It's a way of seeing whether you're outperforming a particular market or index. Topics in international finance, as we are all very aware of now, is crucial because finance doesn't operate within the one country anymore. You might spend your whole life working within, say, Australia and trading overseas. So it's very important that you understand the way exchange rates work, about the barriers to investing in different countries, and how those barriers are increasingly falling through time. And then the last course you look at in the second semester is regression modelling. Now remember, I said statistics is crucial to understanding the way financial markets work and how they interrelate. What is cause, what is effect? You learn things like in derivatives, you might have heard of the Black-Scholes option pricing model. You can't understand how these models work without understanding your basic regression modelling. So this is again about giving you the tools that will help you interpret what you learn on the finance courses better. Now, if you're doing the Master of Financial Management, that's where you stop. You've got a broad base and some deeper knowledge of finance, as well as the tools to help you go further through statistics. If you are going into the Master of Finance or Applied Finance, you continue on to the third semester. So the first semester of year 2. And this is, of the 4 semesters that I'm showing you here, the most practical semester and the one that is rooted the most deeply in industry. The first course you do is applied derivatives, and that is looking at how to value a range of different derivatives instruments. You have your typical things like your futures and forwards on a share, but you also have some rather amusing ones. You've got derivatives on things as diverse as the weather to the next Hollywood blockbuster. But derivatives are very important to understand because derivatives of increasing complexity were part of the problem with the global financial crisis. Right? They were used to split apart risk to the point that no one really understood who bore the risk anymore. And we don't want to make that same mistake again. Likewise, one of your electives, if I jump to the bottom of your third semester, one of the electives you could do is applied financial intermediation and debt markets. Now, I'll show you some other electives in a moment, but again, understanding debt markets is crucial if we're going to avoid what happened in the global financial crisis. It was triggered by the burst of a property market bubble, but ultimately sitting at the core of that were very complex debt instruments that no one really understood, or few people understood who bore the risk and where. Now, if you look at the other 2 courses, Applied Valuation and Portfolio Construction, these are 2 of our most practical courses that we have. I'm biased and I'm going to say they're wonderful courses because one of them is the one that I often teach, Portfolio Construction. But essentially what they do is they're really putting you in the place of someone that is already in the industry and using industry models and real data to start to value companies and form portfolios. So in applied valuation, for example, you are that equity analyst. You are going to have a specific company and you are going to learn how to value that company using real data and put that into a view of an investment recommendation. So you're going to be learning how to say, do I think that Telstra is over or undervalued? In portfolio construction, you're learning how to form a broad multi-asset class portfolio. So not just equities, but also debt, commodities, hedge funds, infrastructure. And it's done with the view of forming a portfolio that is appropriate for your superannuation. Now, what we're going to find is that every person on this call, every person in your class will have a different portfolio that is appropriate for them, right? Superannuation is not a one-size-fits-all thing because every person has a different attitude to risk and return. They have a different set of background assets. They work in a different industry, or a lot of them do. And with all of these slight distinctions between people, how long do they have until retirement as well? the appropriate portfolio will change. So you're going to use real data on the returns of different asset classes, and your lecturer is going to give you an example client. They're going to have specific objectives and constraints, and you're going to learn how to use industry methods in Excel to come up with a recommended asset class mix that will see them through to their retirement years. Right? And one of the reasons I think this course is so critical is even if you didn't end up in the finance industry, we all need a nest egg to see us through our golden years. We all need superannuation or some equivalent of it. So the Master of Applied Finance finishes there. The Master of Finance continues on into the final semester that is more grounded in academic literature. Now, we have academic literature all the way through our programs. We are a research-led university, and we really focus as well on the link between research and practice. But in that final semester, through courses like Advanced Corporate Finance and Advanced Investments, you start to really understand both the original seminal papers on which our financial models are based and the cutting edge research that's going on right now. So it means reading several academic journal papers, replicating some of the tests that they do, and then you're going to use that ability in applied project in finance to undergo some of your own research through a constructed project. And so you'll be overseen by a supervisor as you go through that. And you have another elective as well. So that's an example study plan. And that brings me nicely into the different electives. And I can see, apologies that there is a typo here. Whoop, that should be the Master of Applied Finance includes 6 units of electives, while the Master of Finance includes 12 units. I'm afraid I added this slide last minute and I didn't proofread like I should. Please don't do that in your own courses. Some of the electives that we have. Now I'll talk you through a couple of them, although all of them are available if you look at our programs and courses websites. One of them, though, that might interest you is the College of Business and Economics internship project. Now, this gives you the opportunity to undertake an internship that actually counts as credit towards your degree. Now, again, typically this is really only available to applied finance and finance students, and it might be 6 or 12 units, depending on the setup. But that means that you are actually both getting actual internship experience, which really helps to set you apart in the job market, and it's counting as a course as well. Now, this is one of those courses where you do have requirements in order to enter. There's a minimum GPA requirement. You need to actually find an internship, although we offer a wide range of them. So a lot of them aren't self-sourced. They're sourced with the assistance of the college. But it is definitely something that you want to keep in mind. You also want to be aware, have a look at this course if you're interested, because the applications are earlier than a lot of your other courses. So you want to actually start to get on top of that and plan for it the semester before, at least. Another one that I have to mention, because it's the course that I am on every semester, and I'm one of the 2 conveners of since it first started, is the one listed at the bottom, and that's the Student Managed Fund. Now, this is another course that there is a minimum GPA to enter, and it's also very limited in the number of places that it offers. There's room to take up to 12 students across undergrad and postgrad every 6 months, and students stay in for a year. So typically you'd be looking at this if you're in the Master of Finance. But essentially the Student Managed Fund is a small number, 24 students at any one time, managing real money, about $600,000. And the money, the proceeds of these investments are used to support a CBE equity scholarship. So you're managing real money, and the outflow of that is changing people's lives. You're providing that scholarship. Now, the Student Managed Fund, you have an asset allocation team that looks at the portfolio mix, like what I spoke about with portfolio construction. We have an active equities team. These are your stock pickers. We have a risk and compliance team, and we have a relationship team that markets the fund, if that's an area that you're interested in as well. It's a fantastic course. If you look it up, you can see we also have a website available. There are very limited places you need to apply via interview, as well as GPA cutoffs to get in. But I recommend you look at it early if you're interested, and you can always contact myself or our general Student Managed Fund inquiries line, all of which you will find on the website. You can see, though, we do have a range of electives. They are all very interesting, and it means that you can really pick and choose based on the type of area that you might start to get a feel for what you might be interested in going into. Now, obviously, the electives you pick is going to vary based on what you ultimately want your career objective to be. Now, the nice thing about finance is that of all the disciplines you can look at, it has one of the broadest range of fields that you can then enter. Think about it. It doesn't matter if you are going to be working for an investment bank or for a financial broker or for Apple or Google or for a government. Everyone needs finance teams, right? So it means that there's a huge range of areas where you could really tie in other interests as well. We have Masters of Finance students that are currently in San Francisco working for Google, for example. So we've got a range of different investment paths. I've put down just some of them here, but really it's anything that you could think might have need for someone to advise on money and the management of it. But we have a lot of finance graduates becoming analysts at Australian or overseas retail banks or investment banks. We have graduate analysts in the Commonwealth or Territory State Public Service. Right? That's particularly popular for us because, I mean, we are in Canberra after all, it's the heart of government. We have people that have gone in-house finance in a range of corporations, including Google, as I mentioned before. We have people that end up as risk analysts or derivatives traders and on financial consultants if you want to go onto the buy side. The opportunities are endless, but it's important to keep these in mind as you start to pick and choose with your electives. And you can always contact myself or our CBE info team if you want advice over your program. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention is that it may be that you're in a position where you're interested in one of our finance programs, but you don't yet have, or you might not have, the sufficient GPA to actually enter it correctly. Now, if that's the case, one thing that you might want to consider is our graduate certificate program in Finance, Actuarial Studies and Statistics. Now, this has a lower GPA. From memory, I think it's 4.5, but it isn't, don't quote me on it. Have a look on the website because it's not actually listed here. But essentially what happens is you can enter the graduate certificate program, do the first 4 courses of any of our master's programs, and then you could transfer into the applied finance or finance masters if you get a 60% average across that semester. So that's a useful pathway for those that might not quite have that high enough GPA to enter the program, but ultimately do want to get into the program through this graduate certificate option. Now, if you have any further questions, you can book digital one-on-one appointments, and you've got the link here. And we also have a very active recruitment team that is there to answer any questions that you may have as well. They can also direct you to me. I tend to come in the course advice stage. So you typically contact our recruitment and student informations teams first, talking about your entry into the program. And once you enter the program, they tend to refer you to me to talk about your course selection within it. But you're always welcome to email me directly.